Retaliate now or wait for the chips to fall? Fall they have this Monday. Asian and European markets nosediving for a third straight day as Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, weighing further on investors' minds. China, the first to pull the trigger on reciprocal tariffs. That's in return triggered a tit for tat from the U.S. president himself. Now, keeping their powder dry so far, the Europeans. Best to wait and let the markets temper Trump's zeal for trade barriers? Or, pardon the pun, is it because retribution requires nerves of steel? Last week, France and Germany called on the EU to hit the U.S. where it hurts, its tech sector. But just as the COVID pandemic made Europe realize how overdependent it is on Chinese manufactured goods and medicines, is the old continent just now waking up to the reality that in an increasingly demonetized world, the U.S. controls both the software and the financing of our daily transactions? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what Europe's going to do about those tariffs. And joining us from Europe's capital is France 24 Brussels correspondent Dave Keating. Good to see you, Dave.
Good evening, Francois.
From the Belgian city of Ghent, former Dutch member of the European Parliament, Sophie in 't Veld. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
From Abu Dhabi, economist Alexandre Kateb, founder of multipolarity.ai. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Francois. Thank you for inviting me.
And Jacob Hessler is the global head of consulting at accounting, auditing, and consulting firm Forvis Mazars. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
You can listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. There was this 10-minute period earlier in the day where Wall Street briefly returned to positive territory, but that proved short-lived after a rumor of a moratorium on those tariffs proved unfounded. Tokyo and Shanghai deep in the red. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index closing down over 13%, its biggest one-day drop since 1997. Europe's main markets down between 4 and 5%.
There is only one thing left to do now, and that is to take relatively quick countermeasures. We need to admit that the US president is incompetent.
The U.S. president is totally incompetent. So a bit of financial analysis and psychological profiling. Is he totally incompetent, Jacob Hessler, or is there a strategy to all this? Is this just a big bargain?
I think it's very hard to tell at this moment. I think what is very clear is that he decides, and it's not the Secretary of the Treasury, who has been rumored to actually even possibly leaving. So I'm not sure whether the sort of trying to read into whether or not, I think the real question is this there to stay or not? You know, and we can speculate about motives and, rationales, etc., all we want. The question is it going to stay? And from what it looks, it's going to stay for a reasonable amount of time. And even if it were to go away today, the uncertainty that is now priced in expectations of all market participants has changed the world, even if it were called off today. And that's, I think, what Europe and what the world needs to prepare for.
Sophie in 't Veld, wasn't this uncertainty already hard-baked in the minds of Europeans? After all, it's Donald Trump's second time as U.S. president.
Well, I get the feeling that they've been waking up only in recent weeks, really waking up, because I don't know how many wake-up calls there have been. Today, the Commission and the member states said that there will be a very mitigated response from the European Union, but they're keeping all options on the table. And I hope they're serious about that because, as the previous speaker just said, Trump is so unpredictable. And of course, there is, on the one hand, and this is the dilemma, there's the economic logic, and a full-scale trade war is going to hurt everybody a lot. On the other hand, there's also the political and the psychological aspect. I mean, if you give into this kind of extortion, that's the moral hazard. So Europe is now, we're paying a price not just for Trump's incompetence, or rather insanity, I think, but we're also paying a very high price for Europe's inertia and its state of denial for many, many years. And now, what I can hope for is that we have seen that when it came to defense in the past month or month and a half, the sense of urgency has grown very rapidly, and they're beginning to act. And that is bearing fruit, or I think it will. And I think we will have to do the same kind of de-risking in many other areas. But it will have to be done. And there is not going to be a painless way out of this.
Okay, so let's go over the timeline, Sophie. It was 5 days ago, last Wednesday, when Donald Trump came out with that chart announcing the tariffs for all the different countries. The European Union so far yet to actually spell out its common policy. There was a huddle today in Luxembourg of EU trade ministers. We heard the European Commission president saying that we offered 0 for 0 tariffs for industrial goods, so sort of trying to offer up carrots and sticks. She got the messaging right, Ursula von der Leyen, in this period where Europe is yet to pull the trigger?
But that's difficult to say, yeah, because we don't know if this is the right response, because within 5 minutes, then Donald Trump may change his mind, and then a different response may be required. We don't know, and that is the biggest problem. I think the insecurity. We don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what to prepare for. So we'll see. I suppose the mitigated response comes from the economic logic, saying, if we don't want to escalate further, but it's a very, very fine line they're walking. And we're now talking about, first we were talking about defense, now we're talking about trade tariffs and trade flows. We haven't even started to talk about let's say security in the sense of police and justice and intelligence cooperation. We haven't even talked about the digital the fact that we are so intertwined, we are so dependent on the US for everything digital. We haven't talked about data flow. So, I mean, we're only seeing the beginning of this. So I hope that the government leaders and the European Commission fully understand the scale of the threat.
All right, and even if it's all just a bargaining strategy, even if Donald Trump does bend and reverse course, it's the out-of-the-blue bluntness of the President of the United States, as Jakob was saying at the outset, targeting nations big and small last Wednesday, that's shocked many on this side of the Atlantic. The European Union already felt the shock during Trump's first presidency. Representatives insisting they have the means to retaliate here in Europe. This at the meeting of EU trade ministers in Luxembourg.
I think that we must not exclude any options on goods, on services, whatever the approach, and open the European toolbox, which is very comprehensive and can also be extremely aggressive. I am thinking, of course, of the anti-coercion instrument.
All right, so just Alexandre Kateb, explain for us, please, what is an anti-coercion instrument, just so our viewers understand.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm not specialist of this kind of instrument, but I guess it is the kind of tool that the Commission has at its disposal when it judges that one of its partners exercises an abuse of dominant position over a market. And then, if this is the case, it can force those players, companies, for example, to pay taxes or to divest from the market or whatever other reason that could penalize their activity. And obviously, the target here are the digital groups, the big tech US companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Apple and the new darlings of AI, such as OpenAI, Anthropic, and other related companies. So basically, it would inflict some pain on these companies that are dominant in the services, and especially in high-tech services.
Dave Keating, that anti-coercion instrument, it's a bit of a mouthful to say. Has it ever been used before?
It's never been used before, and actually this is one of the only instances for which the EU got prepared after Donald Trump's first term. This instrument was only adopted in 2021, and the precise reason it was adopted was because of what Donald Trump had done during the first term, and it was in preparation in case he ever came back. It now looks enormously foresighted. The issue is it's never been used, and it's very complicated to use because it's designed in a very different way than, let's say, the normal retaliatory tariffs. So the normal retaliatory tariffs, we've already had a package put forward by the Commission in response to Trump's global tariffs on steel and aluminum and also on automobiles. There's a certain procedure that can be done with that. It's been done before. The Commission did it quite a lot during Trump's first term. The issue is with services, it's a lot more complicated, and that's why the thinking is that if they're going to tariff services, they need to use this anti-coercion instrument. You know, Trump always talks about the trade deficit that the U.S. has with the EU, that the EU exports many goods to the U.S., but they don't import many goods from the U.S. to Europe. For services, it's the exact opposite. Europe exports almost no services to the U.S. Europe is pretty much dependent on services that come from the United States. By services, we mean things that you can't hold in your hands, something as daily as video streaming, as financial transactions, as social media, these tech giants that obviously the U.S. has a big lead on. To tax those, to tariff those, would be a really, really big step. It could majorly hurt U.S. banks, U.S. big tech companies. The question is whether they want to use that so-called nuclear option, and if they do, are they legally covered to do it? Another reason to use the anti-coercion instrument is, as I understand it, it would not need unanimity in the Council to be used, and therefore someone like Viktor Orban or maybe Italy's Giorgia Meloni cannot veto it because it wouldn't be considered a tax. It would be considered a retaliation against a threat from another country. But I'm still hearing a lot of hesitance about using that instrument. I don't think we're going to get any announcement about using the anti-coercion instrument in the next 2 weeks at least.
All right. Jacob Hester, you heard Alexandre Kateb talk about the targeting of big tech. What do you see as the most effective instrument that the EU has as its disposal?
I think the question is what effectiveness are we measuring? Because the reality is today that when you look at the four major tech giants, we can't live without them. So the same effect, if we now massively tax them, that would dramatically increase cost to operate for many companies because you can't just switch. If you are on Microsoft, you can't just say like, oh, I'm not going to buy a Mercedes, I'm just going to buy a Michigan-built Oldsmobile. Well, you can't because you can't switch. And so I think from what I understand, the European Union is very hesitant to go aggressively on any services where there are no alternative. And secondly, I think the question is effective. Retaliation per se may not be a good idea just for the sake of it. The question is how does it inscribe itself in a logic that, and I think takes into account the fact that we have a huge regionalization, deglobalization, and for the region, what can Europe do? What must it do to pursue its own interests? And I think that's the lens through which we should look for everything.
So what would be the effective?
So I think the effective thing is more around the financial system. I think it's about stronger financial integration, which now in the same way nobody thought we could do joint defense. In the same way, nobody thought even a month ago Europe would ever have an integrated financial market. I think that's one of the things, bringing in the digital euro. Those are the kinds of measures we need to take now, urgently, and I think not get deviated in the tit for tat and lose out the bigger picture, which is we need to protect Europe's economic livelihood.
Alexandre Kateb, is this all just about show and pageantry, and so you need to make some kind of very strong signal, or is there an effective way to hit back at Donald Trump's tariffs?
I don't think there is an effective way of hitting back in the sense that every retaliatory measure that Europe would take would bring its own backlash and escalation. So at the end of the day, there is a need to escape this kind of escalation and to de-escalate. And for that,
all right, seem to have lost the signal there with Alexandre Kateb. Apologies for that. We'll reconnect as quickly as possible. Sophie Infeld, your thoughts on what's the most effective way?
Well, in terms of retaliation, as I said earlier, of course, you try to de-escalate as much as possible. At the same time, you cannot reward Donald Trump and his government and the Republican Party, let's not forget, for this behavior. What Europe can do is, and it seems to be doing so, is very, very quickly conclude trade agreements with other countries and other blocs, step up the pace. What we should also do is look at the internal market, which is far from complete. And actually the gains we can have from rapidly completing the internal market and breaking down national barriers, completely eclipse the damage that Donald Trump can do with his trade tariffs, because the trade inside the European Union will also bring us enormous benefits. And there, the national government leaders and the Commission have been basically, dragging their feet for the last 20 years or so. But there we can make progress. And then again, we don't know, because even let's say that the Commission were to and the member states were to come out with a very strong statement today saying, massive retaliatory measures, and then Donald Trump says, oh, but actually, I'm going to suspend the measure for the next 90 days. I mean, you don't know. So taking it step by step, but also making it clear that we are ready to take measures. As to the tech giants, yes, I think our dependence on the tech giants in many sectors, whether it's communications or payments, financial services, and many other things, that has to be addressed as quickly as possible. Of course, look, they're not going to pull out, from one day to the next, because they also need us. But clearly, this dependence is one of the biggest threats that we need to fix ASAP.
Alexandre Kateb, you're back. Sorry about the technical hitches there. The point there just made by Sophie Infeld was last week we heard the president of the European Central Bank say the same thing. There's too many tariffs and taxes between EU member states. Would that be the effective response?
Well, anything that can help render the European economy more competitive is welcome, but I think it misses the big picture that actually this trade war is just a symptom of a massive seismic geopolitical and geoeconomic shift at the global level. Basically, I think there are only two radical choices for Europe. One choice is to become a kind of vassal of the United States in an even stronger way than it is today, and let the political power basically in the hand of Washington as the military power is now. The other alternative is to assert itself in a multipolar world as a completely, independent, autonomous power, but for that it will require a lot of changes, political changes, and also a reorientation of trade, investment to other areas of the world, especially the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, for example, India, with which there is a lot of potential to develop, as well as Russia. Russia is Europe's natural partner, and I think it's time to get back to try to find out these complementarities with Russia that are actually inescapable because of geography. Imagine if tomorrow Donald Trump decides to suspend all energy exports to Europe, all LNG exports to Europe. What happens? Europe, the European economy is dead, basically. So I think the realistic alternative is to get back to Russia and to try to settle the war in Ukraine, obviously, but then to establish some partnership with Russia that should have been established long ago.
We're hearing Jakob Hessler inside of the Chancellor-in-Waiting's party, the CDU, some leaders who are making that same point, that all right, they invaded Ukraine, but we have to do business with Russia because that's realpolitik.
I think that's a whole different debate. I think the question about how we deal with Russia and actually also with China and its role in the world and the fact of, I think that's a different debate. I think, and I wouldn't formulate the alternative as stark, and particularly if you say you don't want to be or continue to be what the colleague calls a vassal of the United States. But I think that the key question is, yes, we want to be more autonomous. We must be more autonomous because the world is changing. The world is regionalizing and deglobalizing. So new supply chains need to be invented, new trading partners, and we need to lower our trade barriers. Let's not forget Canada had higher trade barriers between its provinces than with the US. That was one of the things why they were so vulnerable to the first row of the steel and other tariffs. And I think the European Union must find its own playing field for this, and it must try and define the playing field, because if you argue the playing field is more multilateral, more rules-based, then, well, you have to drink your own Kool-Aid. Otherwise, you'll just be trying to play small hegemon with whatever power you have, and it's not going to work. And I agree that countries like India are obviously having a lot of potential, but let's not forget, just a few months ago, India was the bad, quote-unquote, student of the WTO, of the World Trade Organization, because it was refusing to play along with many of these rules. And there are, even today, in the WTO order of things, there are many country exemptions, and we need to face that reality and then have a sort of a clever, reasonable, and calm strategy, but it's not going to happen overnight. And we need to protect our ability to continue to function economically on our way to there. And that's probably also politically, I think, the message that we need to give to citizens. If we're now just back retaliating and it's going to very short term satisfy our egos, but it's not going to work, we will be in deep trouble, because then these voices that we may jeopardize our security in exchange for economic short-term benefits, these calls will then become ever more louder. And that's not something we should be tampering with.
Yeah, France's EU commissioner in charge of industrial strategy, Stéphane Séjourné, warning on Breakfast Radio this Monday that barring U.S. companies from EU public bids could be one of the things on the table. In the same breath, though, he hinted that bourbon could soon be dropped from a list of U.S. imports hit with additional tariffs. That's not bourbon you're seeing. Those are grapes from the Cognac region. That's because the French makers of Cognac, Dave Keating, stand to lose a lot in this trade war. The French don't drink much cognac anymore. 98% of it is exported either to China or to the United States. How's that goes down in Brussels when you hear the Vice President of the European Commission, who's from France, saying, oh, there might be a carve-out for bourbon?
I think it was not appreciated when he said that, for sure. I mean, what we've had is the national governments going to the European Commission over the past week, hat in hand, saying, this is what we want excluded from this list. So the list of products that the Commission is ready to tariff came out 2 months ago now, right after Trump's initial steel and aluminium tariffs, and countries have been consulting on it, and each government is coming and saying, please take this off. Italy's coming saying, no, the olive oil, take it off. France is saying, take the bourbon off. If the Commission listened to each one of those national entreaties, then we'd have no list left, right? So the behavior of the national governments over the past 2 weeks, they're saying publicly, we need to stay united, and that's how we combat this, but their behavior has been anything but behind the scenes, because it's the same old story. They're looking out for their own national interests first, and that's what they've been lobbying for. Now, Stéphane Séjourné is not supposed to be representing France. He is not a representative of the French government. When he entered the European Commission, he is supposed to leave his nationality and his political affiliation at the door. Many people would say that this intervention was not abiding by that code. I will say he is not one of the more influential commissioners in the Commission, so it's not even clear on what authority or what insight he might have been saying that. But at the end of the day, this is what's happening. Different countries are asking for different products to be excluded.
Sophie Infeld, should we all be drinking more cognac as a patriotic duty?
Well, I'd actually go for the bubbles we saw earlier in the images, but no, but I think they've hit the nail on the head. The problem is, and has been for decades, the attitude of national governments, and the fact that the European Union, despite the fact that lots of people are always talking about this mythical European superstate, which is terrible, which is taking over power. Actually, the opposite is true. We have seen more and more power going to the national capitals, to the government leaders, and not just in terms of decision making or getting all the exceptions that Dave was referring to, but also in terms of the enforcement of EU law, which has now become a kind of currency, political currency. And for example, we're not going to, enforce laws on media freedom in Italy, even if the government is cracking down on journalists, because we need the support of Mrs. Meloni. A European Union in this intergovernmental setting cannot go forward. We need to talk about how we have organized the governments of the European Union. And I know that's not popular, but how we organize our democracy, how we organize the democratic resilience, how we organize our ability to respond to these shockwaves in the world is crucial. And the funny thing is that we're talking the whole time about how American democracy is organized, how American rule of law is organized. But then we refuse to talk about ourselves. And we have to recognize that we cannot go forward like this. And now we will have to improvise. We will have to fix the plane mid-flight. But we'll have to start thinking about a new system, because it's true that Alexandra just now, put it a bit black and white, being either a vassal of the US or a kind of superpower. But what is true is that the world is changing, dramatically, and we cannot continue to pretend that we can run Europe with the system that we have designed 70 years ago.
All right, and you mentioned Dave Keating here present, who in his Substack column sounded the alarm over the way we live in Europe nowadays. How, for instance, we pay for Belgian beer at happy hour with our phones. And the chances are the United States or China's in on the act. You, Dave, in that column showed a clip from last Friday on Irish radio, the European Central Bank president, calling for Europe to take control of its digital payment destiny. Let's listen.
Whether you use a card, or whether you use a phone, typically it goes through Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Alipay. Where are all those coming from? Well, either the US or China. And the whole sort of infrastructure mechanism that allows for the payment, credit and debit, is not
I'm
a
a bit
European
concerned about
solution.
this. I didn't realize this because it means that every time I use my credit card or use my phone, that information about me is leaving the European Union and going to the United States. I thought that was not permitted.
I'm sure they do that, in compliance with European regulations. But yes, that is the point.
So Dave Keating, Christine Lagarde makes it sound as though that can be changed quickly.
So interestingly, it actually could. I think Europeans don't really think about the fact that they are using American technology every time they make an online payment. I think these companies, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, they start to be presented to us as kind of global companies that don't have a nationality or a home, but they do. They are American companies. And right now we don't have any alternative. We have some national payment systems, but those national payment systems, for instance, we have Payconic here in Belgium, can't be used outside Belgium. If I order something from a Dutch website, I can't use that to pay. I have to use an American provider. Now, after I published this morning, actually, I was inundated by people who have been working on this over the past 10 years, contacting me in frustration about just how hamstrung the efforts to develop a single European payments initiative have been. And the general consensus I've been hearing is, yes, the banks have been a bit lazy here, and nobody really, the thinking was, well, Visa, MasterCard works fine, so let's just stick with that no one was thinking that, a company could be a risk simply because it was American. But actually, it was the lack of political will, that if the 27 EU member states came together and said, right, we're doing this right now, it could be done tomorrow. The issue is the national governments have not made almost any effort to try to develop one single European payment system. And as Sophie just said there, now we have to do it mid-flight because the risk that Christine Lagarde was speaking of there is quite real. And I think it's a risk that most people, even though they're using these payment systems every day, haven't really thought much about.
Jakob Hessler, have you thought about it?
Yeah, it's one of the topics that in one of my previous lives I was very interested in. And I think it's the lack of European payment infrastructure, but also and it goes back to financial integration. Because if you say you have a digital euro, it means the banking markets and the financial markets need to be integrated. Because attached to these files and to these transfers are credit decisions, money logic, how long can you keep this payment? And so it was much easier for pan-European or actually international global companies to adopt a single system and just through their individual market orders impose it on these countries and their customers who willingly accept it because it is more convenient than it has been to align every country with each other. But there have been previous examples. I mean, let's not forget the SWIFT system, which is the global interbank or one of the global interbank payment systems, is actually housed in Belgium, if I remember correctly. And I think what we need to do, and that's where I'm not sure that at this moment in mid-flight we cannot suddenly create, I think, a federal European Union. I think the political risk, if we now say Europe is this global thing or nothing, it is this European government.
But hang on, with the payment systems, does it have to be all or nothing? I mean, you heard Dave say, those experts telling David.
No, it doesn't. And I think that's exactly, I think rather than talk about governance, which would mean treaty change, I think there are tons of things we can do without treaty change that strengthen things that we have had. The example of defense. Everyone said if we wanted to have joint defense, we need treaty change. Everyone said if we need more investment in infrastructure, we need treaty change. And we had Euro bonds, EU bonds. Everyone said it needs treaty change. So the European Union is actually quite creative when it is standing with the back to the wall, and it generally acknowledges that it is, to come up with some pragmatic solutions. And in flight at this moment, I don't see others. We can, in midterm, prepare for a stronger political integration that follows stronger economic integration, but political integration that precedes more economic integration at this moment, I'm not sure it would work. And it would all nationalists in each member country give a big incentive to become anti-European, and then we destroy the notion of the
actually this defense initiative of our security that is rebalancing more as a collective of nation state at this very moment. Whether we like it or not, that's a whole different question.
Sophie Infeld.
I'm sorry, I very much disagree with that. And the point is also, I've been doing European politics for 30 years, and I've been hearing this for 30 years. And this is where it brought us. And when you talk about defense, I think that's a very good example, because a lot of people say, oh, look, Europe is acting because it's with its back against the wall. But whenever there's a crisis, Europe is acting. But let's look closely at what has been decided here. There is not a big European fund of 800 billion euro for a European defense union. What they did is raising the debt levels for national armies who will continue to buy American equipment. So, and the equipment they buy is not for the next 2 or 3 years. It's an investment for decades. So there is just no will among the government leaders to create a Europe that is able to act. I also disagree with you that the only thing we can do is treaty change, because there is a lot and we need treaty change, we do, but there is a lot we can do without it. We could actually start by applying the treaties, because if you look at the government leaders in the European Council of Government Leaders, they have been engaging in a complete power grab, taking powers from the two legislators, taking powers from the European Commission. And actually, as I said earlier, they've paralyzed the Commission when it comes to enforcement. They could eliminate national barriers in the internal market. You don't need treaty change for that. They can take more steps in the area of defense without treaty change, and they should do so.
Yes, I agree with that, but that is not a European government. That is improving with existing instruments and creative, making the functioning and the way things function, which is not the same. You could argue the same thing about defense. So you have national armies, but how long would it take today? We don't even have effective national armies in Europe outside of the UK, France, and Poland, and then some smaller countries.
Yes, but
the idea of creating a collective European defense force right now is a project for in 20, 30 years. Yes, we should launch it, but I don't think it's realistic. But then maybe I'm too pessimistic.
Well, can I respond to that?
Sure, Sophie Infeld.
Yeah. No, the point is, no, we're not going to create a European army by next week. But if what is now being presented as, oh, look, Europe is taking action in the area of defense is actually not true. It is, again, the national governments who get more possibilities to borrow money. That's essentially what's happening. And there is no initiative except for some timid initiatives by the Commission that are being dismissed by the national government leaders to try and at least harmonize a little and to have some forward planning so that we will end on that road. Yeah, well, was.
I know.
Plan
but
for the future,
NATO
not for the
was our
past.
European defense, and it was a multilateral, coordinated defense of individual armies, which, had the US not opted out or opted to look at it in a different way.
We could see this coming.
No, I'm not saying
we saw this coming,
that,
and we didn't respond.
All right, we're getting urgents coming from the European Commission in the last minutes, and one of them, Dave Keating, is the EU Commission removing U.S. bourbon from its list of goods to face counter-tariff measures. That's according to a document, the same document that proposes 25% tariffs on U.S. goods to take effect from May 16th. So that gives a bit of time to negotiate some more. And counter tariffs on a range of U.S. imports at 25%. This in response to steel duties. So again, giving itself perhaps more breathing room, while at the same time starting to sharpen the focus on where it might hit. Alexandre Kateb, just getting back to this example we gave of the payments you make with your smartphone and trying to make it a whole European ecosystem instead of having to go through Visa and MasterCard or PayPal. would that weaken or strengthen the argument for the EU as a safe haven currency? The euro,
would obviously, and the European Union and the European financial markets. I think the problem is here that you hear Christine Lagarde saying that we use only American technology and companies, but what has she done over all these years? I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible that the European Central Bank has not been able to move beyond some pilots. If we are talking about the digital euro, for example, look at what China did. Look at what Russia did. Look at what the United Arab Emirates did in this regard.
And is that the fault of the ECB or the fault of the member states?
It's not the fault of the ECB.
It is on the political side, it is the fault of the member states, but on the business and technical side, it is very much the fault of the ECB, because the ECB is the control tower of the European financial and banking system. So the ECB must provide this impulse, this impetus. And for now, over all these years, I think the mountain has given birth to something that is not even worth really talking about, and that's really the reality. This gap between the ambition and what we observe on the ground.
Yeah, the mountain, in French, the expression is, I believe, a mountain giving birth to a mouse. Dave Keating, let me ask you, because this overdependence on U.S. defense that we've talked about, but also the overdependence on U.S. financial services, you argue that it's also inflected our consumer culture. We've talked a lot on this show about how free speech absolutism, First Amendment in the U.S. Has an impact here in Europe when it comes to things like social media. But here, you mentioned something quite basic. Suddenly, this pressure to tip, which we didn't used to have here in the EU.
Yeah, it's this very weird effect of us here in Europe using American payment systems, is that we've started to have these prompts to tip on the tablet-style screens that you pay on here in Europe and in the US. And because those systems were made in the US, we're starting to get prompted to ask if we'd like to leave a tip. Now, we don't do that here in Belgium. And in most European countries, you wouldn't tip a clerk at a store. And so, we're frequently in the situation now where the clerk is embarrassed about this number. I usually find they just come over and they hit no themselves, or they say, I don't know, it's an American system, so that's what we have. But that's just a very tangible way in which that culture infects Europe. And that's just one way because of the dependence on the financial transactions. But it's true if we look at where we get our media, where Europeans read news articles, if it's not in their own country, if they're reading a news article about the EU, it's going to be from the UK or more likely the US, because it's in English, the lingua franca of the EU. If we look at television consumption, radio consumption, Europe consumes so much culture from the US that, young people here could be forgiven for having the impression that they actually live in the United States, with the degree to which the US is kind of omnipresent in all of our lives here in Europe. This is something that is so ingrained that, as was mentioned before, this stuff is not going to be solved in a week. This is a problem that has been decades in the making, and it's going to take decades to solve. I think that the balance that has to be struck here is you have to figure out what you can do in the short term, which is not treaty change, which is not constitutional reform of the EU itself. You have to focus on what you can do in the short term, but also plant the seeds to get ready to change, because you have to start somewhere. And if we just keep saying, it'll take too long, there's no time, then nothing will ever change. And Europe will continue that dependency for the foreseeable future.
So Jacob Hassler is pining to intercede. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I want to thank you so much, Dave Keating. I want to thank Alexandre Cattet for being with us from Abu Dhabi, Sophie Intveld from Ghent, Jacob next time we'll do it. We'll do it again. Well, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.